In my series on the book A Beginner's Guide Building Better Worlds, today I'll be talking about Chapter 7, which is about the Zapatista educational system. And this is something crucial, and I think this is the heart of the book, and we could learn a lot from it. So let's begin. So first of all, the writers of the book first give us kind of a distinction between EZLN, which is the politico-praxis-driven organization, and then the Zapatista communities. Now, EZLN, according to our writers, is a hierarchical organization with a strict command structure and discipline. But it becomes democratic because it cannot take any decisions unless the input from the Zapatista communities comes to them. So they actually have their own command structure, but they follow the dictates as directed to them by the Zapatista communities. Now, the name of the Zapatista movement, of course, comes from the historic leader Zapata, right, who was the leader of the Southern resistance and who actually fought for the peasant rights. Now, in order to understand this chapter, the authors actually have done the work. They have taught us a little bit in the previous chapters about neoliberalism. They have taught us what happened under NAFTA, right? North Atlantic Free Trade Agreements. They have taught us about critical pedagogy and political education. And so we bring that knowledge to this chapter. This is the chapter in which we are told and taught how the Zapatista communities organize their education. Now, in order to clearly understand it, of course, you'll have to read the chapter carefully, but just keep in mind what is the purpose of education in the capitalistic system. If you go by Louis Althusser and others, obviously the system of education that you, me, and others are a part of here, formal education, its purpose is to reproduce the capitalistic society, people who work in it. It also kind of detaches us from the praxis and from the world and just trains us to be cogs in the machines of capital. Mostly, it isolates us from each other and pits us against each other because it has to produce those subjects who will take this as the truth and live in it without thinking of the alternatives. Now, the Zapatista educational system, which is also an ecological educational system, an educational system which is deeply political, also creates the subjectivities that the Zapatistas want to emerge out of their educational system, formal or informal. What would be that subjectivity? So if you are an organization of people who have faced and suffered for 500 years at the hands of different kinds of colonizers, and then were the first ones who faced the onslaught after NAFTA was implemented, obviously then your educational system would be geared towards indigenous autonomy. It would be connected to land. It will try to teach the young people how to understand their land, how to understand a history of their oppression, how to learn how to resist, right? But also how to value their own culture, indigenous customs, and land. And coupled with that is a certain kind of egalitarianism, right? No sexism, no racism, right? No property drive, no drive of acquisitive capital. So on one hand, we have a system governed by a system of capitalism, which is based in property rights, individual property rights, and built on competition, built on acquiring more and more wealth. In opposition to that, the Zapatista system of education gives us an idea of how to develop an indigenous collectivist social identity, an identity that doesn't just look at its own interest, but also the interest of the community, which knows its history and which knows where the fight is. So that is brilliant about the Zapatista educational system. Now, let me take you slightly on a detour, because a lot of us on the left who try to theorize a new kind of praxis of education, we go to Paulo Freire, of course, just as our authors here do. But my mentor, Dr. Robin Goodman, I think about 10 years ago, she wrote a book called World Class Women. I'll post a link in the description to the book. And in that book, she's trying to theorize a sort of practical feminist pedagogy, critical feminist pedagogy. And towards the end of the book, she takes us to Botswana, to a book written by the South African Botswanan author Bessie Head, and it was entitled Sirau. And in that book, Bessie Head tells the story of working at a special school, which was funded by United Nations, but was run by indigenous people. And the system of education they followed was that it was a self-sustaining school. Children were taught basic skills of computation and writing, but they were also taught how to live in the land where they live. They produced their own food, they learned different kinds of crafts. And so Robin, in opposition to, or Dr. Goodman, in opposition to the contemporary model of education that we follow here in the United States, offers that as another model of education for young people. Now, this book, by retrieving what the Zapatista educational system privileges, actually is giving us a much more practical and convincing model. So wherever we teach, even in urban areas, connecting our students to the land, to the place where they live, its struggles, right? And to the other people who might be struggling under the same system could be one thing that we can gain from this. Being aware of the environment, the ecological aspects of education, which the Zapatista education has, because in their case, they live so close to the natural environment that any intrusion into it, any destruction of it can really impact their own lives. We can take that from that system of education and incorporate it, if not formally, informally, in our discussions of what happens in the world and what happens in our education system. So in other words, the Zapatista system of education is praxis-based education. Students do learn basic skills of reading and writing, but then they are also learning the knowledge which is in the community about the plants, about the nature around them. What are the indigenous ways of dealing with land problems, agriculture, seeds, in opposition to a system imposed from outside, which what did it do when NAFTA went into force? Of course, then privatization of the land was first consequence. And when that happens, natives and indigenous people are pushed into what kind of labor? The maquiladoras, right? The labor-intensive spaces created by international corporations right on the US-Mexican border, and forcing people from their land so that their only option is to work there, right? The slave labor work, which kind of, if you look at it historically, is kind of the same as the rise of the first proletariat in England, right? When the peasants are removed from the land or forced off their land, where do they go? They go to the cities. Where do they work? In the factories for whatever wage is offered to them. So when that imperative reaches the Zapatista communities, remember, we can kind of trace the beginning of the contemporary Zapatista movement to 1983. So it means it kind of preceded the arrival of NAFTA. But the struggle was the same: how not to become part of a labor force which has no access to land or to its resources, which is forced out and then made into a proletariat, into a rootless group of individuals seeking their own livelihood at whatever is offered to them. So Zapatista education then is connected to land, connected to their own communal history, and connected to equality of sexes, right? And resistance to any imperatives from outside. Overall, if we look at it, then it is a great example of what our authors have been calling political education. What kind of a political education? A political education that is grounded in praxis, that is connected to land and the struggles of the people, which is collectivist, in opposition to the neoliberal order, and which tries to save, protect, and disseminate the native knowledges about the land, about history, about the struggle, and then constantly keeps working towards reproducing more of that kind of communal resistant thinking. So if you think about it critically and carefully, what is being offered to us then is a system of education which will be sort of in opposition to the system of education which we have here, which is considered normative, and that is that we produce people who have certain skills. They are detached from each other. They are usually in competition with each other. They do not know the history of their own struggles or the struggles of people around them because they are so much focused on their own success. And in the end, then we create these isolated individuals who compete each other, right? Trample each other somewhat to succeed in a system, to get the scraps that the system throws at them. The political education explained in this chapter and offered by the Zapatistas then gives us another mode of reproducing society, a society that is based in tolerance, that is based in struggle, that is based in a strong connection to land and to the communities and to other peoples, and which is aware of the imperatives of the powers that be, including neoliberal acquisitive capital. So resistance then isn't something that you just wake up and start doing. It's part of the educational system itself. Native knowledges are part of that educational system. They are not derided, right? So I'm not going to go into the detail of each section of this chapter, but just keep in mind these are some of my thoughts, somewhat what I have understood from it, but do pay special attention to this chapter because after you've finished reading this chapter, you would have gotten from it a viable, praxis-driven alternative to the capitalistic system of education, to the contemporary system of education being followed in the United States, but also everywhere else in the world. Now, how do we modify it for our own purposes in the formal classrooms or actually in communities in struggle? That's where the Zapatistas can teach us. And remember, the Zapatistas will never say to you, we have it here, take this system and follow it. They will always offer what they do as one way of doing things, one way of producing an educational system geared towards social justice. You can then take it and modify it according to your own community, wherever you are. The only thing to keep in mind is that this is one of the few places on the planet, right, in Chiapas, run by the Zapatista movement, a system of education which is cognizant of the world and the global imperatives of power and capitalism. And this system of political education then has been developed and is being followed and practiced by a group of people who have at least 500 years of history of struggle, who have land that they have protected and they are constantly trying to protect, the knowledge about that land, and then passing that knowledge on, the love of the land, but also the love of nature and preservation of nature. All of that is built into their educational system. So I hope you really read this chapter carefully. I apologize in advance that I haven't covered it paragraph by paragraph. Someday, maybe I will do a close reading of the chapter and maybe record a longer conversation about it. But at this point, if you're reading the book or discussing it, I hope these few thoughts are useful to you and help you read the book differently, probably more carefully. That's all. I'll be happy if you share your ideas, your thoughts, and I'll respond to them. And please feel free to educate me if I misunderstood anything or if I didn't cover anything important that you thought that you think I should have dealt with. Thank you so much. Stay safe, take care, and peace and love.